Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to temporarily step out of our modern world and plunge right into the sensory, material reality of everyday life in the past. We aren't going to be looking at rulers or grand wars today. Instead, we're focusing on the daily survival of ordinary people, starting with the very fluid of existence itself, the crisp, cold, and sometimes perilous reality of water. Right, so let's tackle a massive modern assumption head-on. You've probably heard the idea that people in the Middle Ages or antiquity simply never drank water because it was universally contaminated, right? The story goes that they existed in this constant state of mild inebriation just to survive. But we have to ask ourselves, does the historical record actually support that? To get to the bottom of this, we really need to look at primary sources. If you look at 15th century texts, like this manual by Thomas Forstier, you do see stark warnings about foul, stagnant water near growing cities. He literally notes that when drinks are made of this corrupt water, many sickness is gendered in man's body. So make no mistake, the fear of tainted water was absolutely real. Section 1. The myth of contaminated water. But here is where it gets fascinating. The idea that historical populations were just constantly inebriated is fundamentally flawed. It turns out, our understanding of the past has been heavily distorted by the catastrophic sanitation failures of the 19th century Industrial Revolution. Victorian reformers looked at the horrifying smoke-choked conditions of their own overcrowded slums and essentially retroactively projected that squalor onto antiquity. In reality, for the vast majority of the global population, life was entirely rural. For a peasant, drawing clear, crisp water from a deep, stone-lined well, a natural spring, or a rushing brook was just a normal, everyday feature of life. And on top of that, they developed a highly localized generational immunity to the specific bacterial strains in their native soil. A traveler passing through might fall violently ill from a foreign well, sure, but the locals, they could drink from it with absolute impunity. Section 2. Engineering ancient water supplies. And our ancestors were far from ignorant about their environments. They actually possessed a really sophisticated empirical understanding of water quality. Take the Maya at Tikal over 2,000 years ago. They faced brutal dry seasons, and to survive, they engineered these massive reservoirs using crushed zeolite and quartz that they transported from miles away. These acted as advanced molecular sieves. They were intuitively harnessing complex chemical adsorption filters to remove pathogens and heavy metals literally centuries before modern sanitation even existed. But what happened in places where water was scarce or populations were just incredibly dense? Well, this cuneiform tablet from 3200 BCE Mesopotamia gives us the answer. In those early densely packed urban centers, surplus grain was transformed into a rudimentary thick beer. This wasn't just about safe hydration, it was edible money. The boiling and fermentation provided safe calories, which allowed the very first cities to function without completely collapsing from waterborne disease. We also see this incredible cause and effect relationship between governing institutions and everyday survival. Rulers actively protected water access. Islamic waqfs funded public sabils, which were these beautiful fountains providing free, chilled water as a religious charity. In 7th century England, King Edwin in Northumbria hung bronze cups by clear roadside springs just to physically refresh travelers. Access to pure water was seen as the ultimate hallmark of a civilized, well-governed society. Section 3. Humors, boiling, and fuel. So, if fresh, protected water was out there, why did peasants and emperors alike sometimes actively avoid drinking it? Well, it wasn't because of modern germ theory. It was based on a 1,500-year-old medical paradigm known as galenic humoral theory. Back then, human health was believed to depend on a super delicate internal balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry humors. Drinking cold, raw water, especially with a meal, was thought to cause metabolic chilling, literally solidifying food in your stomach. It was a sensory and medical choice, not a fear of microbes. And environmental constraints fundamentally shaped these daily habits. For example, in Northern Europe, firewood was incredibly scarce. Peasants simply couldn't afford the fuel to boil water every single day. So they relied on cold fermentation, creating bitter, weak small beer that preserved their hydration and gave them calories for grueling manual labor. Conversely, over in China, ancient medical texts mandated drinking hot, rolled-boiled water to expel internal dampness. Because they had access to different fuel resources, this eventually evolved into a vast, steaming tea-drinking culture. When you lay it all out, it's amazing to see how humans across the globe adapted so brilliantly to their specific geography. Roman soldiers drank posca, which was this sharp mix of water and vinegar, and its acidity actually killed microbes while they were on campaign. The Inca crafted chicha, utilizing salivary mastication and natural clay decantation, and traditional China relied on boiling river water for tea. Every single culture engineered its own unique shield against the perils of raw hydration. Section 4. Escaping the Malthusian Trap. Now, here's where it gets really big. These deeply ingrained everyday hydration habits actually decided the fate of the modern world. Historically, populations were caught in what's known as the Malthusian Trap. Basically, as human populations grew and urbanized, they inevitably outstripped their resources. The dense concentration of human waste in early cities bred devastating waterborne epidemics like dysentery, and that acted like a grim demographic ceiling, physically capping human economic progress. But, according to anthropologist Alan McFarlane's thesis, something kind of miraculous happened in 18th century Britain. The population was rapidly industrializing and urbanizing, which really should have triggered massive disease outbreaks. But instead, between 1650 and 1740, infant mortality actually halved. Why? Because the British were drinking beer preserved with antibacterial hops and increasingly boiling their water to make tea. This simple, daily act of brewing acted as an invisible biophysical shield. This divergence historically explains why the Industrial Revolution exploded specifically in Britain. France and the Netherlands, for instance, had the wealth to industrialize, for sure, but they lacked a national tea-drinking habit to protect their dense urban workers. Japan drank boiled tea and had a high literacy, but they actively rejected labor-saving machinery to prevent unemployment. So Britain possessed this perfect, accidental combination of boiled water, antibacterial hops, and industrial ambition to escape the Malthusian trap entirely. Section 5. The Urban Cholera Crisis. But you know that delicate historical equilibrium of weak beer and boiled tea? It was eventually and violently shattered. Just imagine the sensory reality of a 19th century industrial slum. Millions of rural families flooded into manufacturing hubs, completely overwhelming the decentralized traditional systems of local wells. Cities transformed into these chaotic, overcrowded centers of labor. Cesspools were leaking directly into local water supplies, creating an overwhelming, suffocating stench, and ultimately birthing a new era of absolute terror, the cholera epidemics. At the time, this was driven by miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air or foul smells. The sheer scale of urban mortality was just staggering. During the 1854 Soho cholera outbreak in London, hundreds died in mere days. People knew the environment was unhealthful, and they'd often blame the water or the air, but the true microscopic cause was entirely invisible to them. So the crucial takeaway here is that modern centralized sanitation wasn't born out of some sudden stroke of enlightenment. It was forced upon us by sheer necessity. When Dr. John Snow famously mapped that 1854 outbreak to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, he helped shift medical understanding toward germ theory. This catastrophic cholera forcing societies to engineer massive municipal sand filtration and chlorination systems. We didn't build modern sanitation because it was a neat idea. We built it because we literally had to survive. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. Right now, you and I can turn on a tap and just take clean water completely for granted, relying entirely on this massive, invisible, centralized infrastructure. But for almost all of human history, securing hydration was a deliberate, daily act of survival. It was shaped by geography, fuel, medicine, and sheer human ingenuity. As we look around at our own modern conveniences, how do you think historians 1,000 years from now will view our habits, and more importantly, our vulnerabilities? Because the truth is, we are still deeply connected to the exact same constraints of survival that shaped our ancestors.